Officer Jake Thompson slammed his patrol car door harder than he meant to. The sound echoed through the quiet neighborhood like a gunshot. He was tired, angry, and fed up with everything. His shift was supposed to end 2 hours ago, but here he was, still driving around these fancy streets because his sergeant wanted extra patrols in the area. Jake rubbed his eyes and looked at his watch. Almost midnight. His wife would be asleep by now, probably angry that he missed dinner again. This was the third time this week. The bills were piling up. His performance review had gone terribly, and rumors were flying around the station that budget cuts were coming. Everyone knew what that meant. Some officers would lose their jobs. The radio crackled to life. Unit 47. We have a noise complaint on Maple Street. Can you check it out? Jake grabbed the radio with more force than necessary. Unit 47 responding, he said through gritted teeth. Another pointless call. Probably some rich folks complaining about their neighbor's music being too loud. As he drove through the upscale neighborhood, Jake felt his anger growing. These people had everything handed to them. Big houses, expensive cars, perfect lawns. They probably never worried about losing their jobs or paying bills. They just called the police whenever something bothered them, expecting officers like him to come running. He turned onto Maple Street and saw the house right away. It was huge, with a circular driveway and fancy landscaping. All the lights were off except for one on the front porch. Jake parked and got out, already planning what he would say. Keep it short, make it clear the music needs to stop, and get back to the car. But as he walked toward the house, he noticed someone standing near the mailbox. A man in a dark suit was checking his phone, looking like he had just gotten home from somewhere important. Jake stopped walking. Something about the situation bothered him, though he couldn't put his finger on what. The man looked up as Jake approached. He was well dressed, probably in his 40s, with an expensive watch and polished shoes. Everything about him screamed success and money. Jake felt his jaw tighten. "Evening, officer," the man said politely. "Is everything okay?" Jake studied him for a moment. "We got a noise complaint about this address. You live here?" "Yes, I do, but I just got home a few minutes ago. I haven't made any noise." "Well, someone called it in," Jake said, his voice harder than it needed to be. "Mind if I ask what you were doing out so late?" The man looked puzzled. "I was at a work function downtown, a dinner meeting that ran late. Is there a problem?" Jake felt his anger bubbling up again. Here was another person who got to go to fancy dinners while he was working overtime just to make ends meet. "Work function, huh? What kind of work do you do?" "I work in law enforcement," the man replied simply. That made Jake even angrier. "Law enforcement? Like what? Security guard? Private investigator?" The man hesitated for a moment. "I'm a police officer, actually. I start a new position on Monday." Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Right, sure you are. You expect me to believe that someone like you is a cop?" "Someone like me?" the man asked, his voice staying calm despite the obvious tension. "Come on, man, look at yourself. That suit probably costs more than I make in a month. Real cops don't dress like that. Real cops don't live in houses like this." Jake gestured toward the massive home behind them. The man took a step back. "Officer, I think there might be some misunderstanding here. I really am in law enforcement. I can show you my credentials if you'd like." "Credentials can be faked," Jake snapped. "Besides, even if you are a cop, you're probably one of those desk jockeys who never worked a real day on the street. You probably got your job because of some diversity program or political connections." The temperature seemed to drop between them. The man's expression hardened, but he kept his voice level. "I think you should be careful about the assumptions you're making, officer." But Jake was past the point of being careful. All the frustration of the past weeks came pouring out. "Assumptions? I know exactly what I'm looking at. People like you come into our neighborhoods, buy the biggest houses, act like you own the place. Then when real working people like me try to do our jobs, you play the victim card." "People like me?" the man repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. Jake realized he had said too much, but he was too angry to stop now. "Yeah, people like you know what I mean?" The man stared at him for a long moment. "No, officer. Why don't you explain exactly what you mean by people like me?" Jake felt his face getting hot. He knew he was crossing a line, but something inside him didn't care anymore. He was tired of being polite, tired of following rules that didn't seem to apply to everyone equally. "You want me to spell it out for you?" Before the man could answer, Jake did something that would change both their lives forever. In a moment of pure rage and prejudice, he spat directly at the man's feet, some of it splashing onto his expensive shoes and pants. "That's what I think of people like you," Jake said, his voice shaking with anger. "You don't belong in this neighborhood, and you sure don't belong wearing a badge." The man stood completely still for several seconds, looking down at his stained clothing. When he looked back up at Jake, his eyes were cold and calm in a way that was somehow more frightening than anger. Would have been. "Officer Thompson," he said, reading Jake's name tag, "I want you to remember this moment very carefully. Remember every word you just said and every action you just took." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Something about the way the man said his name made him realize he might have made a serious mistake. But his pride wouldn't let him back down now. "Are you threatening me?" Jake asked, trying to sound tough. "No threat," the man replied calmly. "Just advice. I suggest you think very carefully about whether this is the kind of officer you want to be." Jake wanted to say something else, something that would put this guy in his place once and for all. But something in the man's voice made him hesitate. Instead, he turned and walked back to his patrol car without another word. As he drove away, Jake looked in his rearview mirror and saw the man still standing there, perfectly still, watching him leave. The image stuck with him as he finished his shift and drove home through the empty streets. He told himself he had done nothing wrong. The guy was probably some rich businessman pretending to be a cop to impress people. Jake had dealt with plenty of people like that before. They thought money and fancy clothes made them better than everyone else. But as he pulled into his driveway and sat in his car for a moment, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something about the encounter had been different. The way the man had stayed so calm, the way he had said Jake's name like he was memorizing it. Jake shook his head and got out of the car. He was overthinking things. Tomorrow was his day off, and by Monday he would have forgotten all about the guy in the expensive suit. Little did he know that Monday would bring the biggest shock of his career. Monday morning came too quickly for Jake Thompson. He had spent the weekend trying to forget about the encounter on Maple Street, but something about it kept nagging at him. His wife had noticed he was quieter than usual, picking at his food and staring off into space. "You okay, honey?" she had asked Sunday night. "Yeah, just work stuff," he had replied, not wanting to get into details about what had happened. Now, as he walked into the police station at 7 in the morning, Jake tried to push those thoughts aside. Today was important. The whole department was buzzing with excitement and nervousness about meeting their new commander. Everyone knew the department needed changes, but nobody knew what to expect from the new boss. Jake grabbed his coffee from the break room and found his usual spot in the back of the main conference room. Officers were filing in slowly, some looking excited, others worried about what changes might be coming. The room filled with the low murmur of conversations and speculation. "I heard he's some hotshot from Chicago," Officer Rodriguez said, settling into the seat next to Jake. "Great. Another outsider who thinks he knows how to fix everything," muttered Officer Barnes from behind them. Jake nodded but didn't join the conversation. He was still thinking about Saturday night, about the man who claimed to be a police officer. Something about that encounter felt unfinished, like a loose thread that hadn't been tied off properly. At exactly 8 o'clock, Sergeant Collins walked to the front of the room and called for attention. The conversations died down as everyone turned toward the small stage area where a podium had been set up. "Good morning, everyone," Sergeant Collins began. "I know you've all been waiting to meet our new commander. Before I bring him out, let me give you a little background." Jake half listened as Collins talked about budget improvements, community relations, and new training programs. His mind was still on the weekend, on that feeling that he had missed something important during his encounter with the well-dressed man. "Our new commander comes to us with 22 years of experience in law enforcement. Collins continued. He has a degree from Boston University and has served in leadership roles in 3 different departments. Most recently, he was instrumental in reforming the Community Relations Program in Chicago, where complaints against officers dropped by 70% during his tenure. Jake's attention sharpened a little. 70% was impressive if it was true. Maybe this new commander actually knew what he was doing. He specializes in constitutional policing, de-escalation techniques, and building trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve, Collins went on. He's also known for his zero-tolerance policy when it comes to officer misconduct. That last part made Jake shift uncomfortably in his seat. Zero tolerance could mean anything. Hopefully, it just meant he was tough on serious stuff like corruption and excessive force, not minor issues like attitude problems or personality conflicts. "Ladies and gentlemen," Collins said, "please welcome Commander David Williams." The room erupted in polite applause as a figure walked out from the side door. Jake clapped along with everyone else, craning his neck to get a good look at their new boss. The man was tall, well-built, and walked with the confident stride of someone used to being in charge. But as the figure reached the podium and turned to face the room, Jake's blood turned to ice. It was him, the man from Saturday night. The man Jake had confronted, insulted, and spat at was now standing at the front of the room in full dress uniform, 3 stars on his collar, looking out at the assembled officers with calm, professional eyes. Jake felt like he might throw up. His coffee cup slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor, the hot liquid splashing across his shoes. Several officers around him glanced over, but Jake barely noticed. His entire world had just collapsed. Commander Williams began speaking, his voice clear and authoritative. "Good morning. I'm honored to be here and to have the opportunity to serve alongside all of you." Jake couldn't focus on the words. All he could hear was the blood rushing in his ears. This couldn't be happening. The man he had treated with such disrespect, the man he had spat at, was now his boss. Not just his boss, but the person who would have complete control over his career, his future, his family's livelihood. "I believe in fair, constitutional policing," Williams continued. "I believe in treating every person in our community with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or circumstances." Jake wondered if those words were directed at him specifically. Was Williams looking at him? Jake couldn't tell from the back of the room, but he felt exposed, like everyone could see his guilt written across his face. "I also believe in accountability," Williams said, his voice taking on a slightly harder edge. "Every officer in this department will be held to the highest standards of professional conduct. There will be no exceptions and no excuses for behavior that undermines the trust between police and the community." Now Jake was sure Williams was talking about him. The words felt like a direct message, a warning about what was to come. Jake's hands were shaking and sweat was beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Williams talked about his vision for the department, about new training programs and community outreach initiatives. He spoke about the importance of officers representing the best of law enforcement, about earning respect through actions rather than demanding it through authority. "Each of you has taken an oath to serve and protect," Williams said, looking out over the room. "That oath is not just words. It's a sacred commitment to the people we serve and to each other. When one officer fails to live up to that oath, we all suffer the consequences." Jake felt like he was going to be sick. He wanted to get up and leave, but he couldn't move. Everyone around him was listening intently, some nodding in agreement, others looking thoughtful. No one else seemed to notice that their new commander was essentially describing exactly the kind of officer Jake had been on Saturday night. "I want to be clear about something from the beginning," Williams continued. "I'm not here to make anyone's life difficult. I'm here to help this department be the best it can be. But that means we need to be honest about our shortcomings and committed to addressing them." Williams paused and seemed to scan the room. For a moment, Jake was convinced their eyes met across the crowded space. "If any officer has concerns about my leadership or questions about my expectations, my door is always open. I believe in direct communication and honest conversations." The presentation continued for another 20 minutes, but Jake didn't hear any of it. His mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. Should he approach Williams after the meeting and try to apologize? Should he pretend the encounter never happened and hope Williams wouldn't remember him? Should he request a transfer to another department? But even as these thoughts raced through his head, Jake knew it was too late for any of those options. Williams would remember him. A man didn't forget being treated the way Jake had treated him on Saturday night. And from what Jake had just heard about Williams' background and philosophy, there was no way this would just blow over. When the meeting finally ended, officers began filing out of the room, chatting among themselves about their new commander. Jake remained frozen in his seat, watching as Williams shook hands with senior staff and answered questions from several officers who had approached the podium. "What did you think?" Rodriguez asked, stopping by Jake's seat. "What?" Jake looked up, realizing he had been staring. "The new commander. Seems like he knows what he's talking about." "Yeah," Jake managed. "Seems like it." Rodriguez gave him a strange look. "You feeling okay, Thompson? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jake forced a smile. "Just tired. Long weekend." As Rodriguez walked away, Jake finally managed to stand up. His legs felt weak, and he had to grab the back of his chair for support. Across the room, Williams was still talking with other officers, but Jake could feel the man's presence like a weight on his shoulders. Jake made his way toward the exit, trying to blend in with the crowd of officers leaving the room. But just as he reached the door, he heard his name called. "Officer Thompson." Jake's blood froze. He turned slowly and saw Williams looking directly at him from across the room. Several other officers were still around the commander, but his attention was focused entirely on Jake. "Could I see you in my office in 1 hour?" Williams asked, his voice carrying clearly across the room. Jake nodded, not trusting his voice to work properly. "Yes, sir." Williams nodded once and turned back to his conversation with the other officers. Jake stumbled out of the room and down the hallway, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. 1 hour. In 1 hour, he would have to face the man he had insulted and humiliated. Only this time that man would be wearing the uniform of a commander and holding Jake's career in his hands. The hour felt like the longest 60 minutes of Jake Thompson's life. He tried to go about his normal routine, checking equipment and reviewing reports, but his hands shook every time he picked up a piece of paper. Other officers noticed his strange behavior, but Jake just mumbled excuses and tried to stay busy. Meanwhile, Commander Williams had settled into his new office and was already getting to work. The previous commander's personal items had been removed over the weekend, and the space now reflected Williams' professional approach. Awards and commendations lined one wall, while another displayed photos from community events and training programs he had organized in previous positions. Williams sat behind his desk, reviewing personnel files that had been prepared for him. The stack was thick, containing detailed information about every officer in the department. Performance reviews, complaint records, commendations, and disciplinary actions were all documented in careful detail. When he reached Jake Thompson's file, Williams paused. He had already looked up the information Sunday morning, right after returning home from his encounter on Maple Street. What he found was troubling, but not surprising. Officer Thompson had been with the department for 8 years. His early reviews had been decent, showing promise and dedication. But over the past 3 years, there had been a steady decline. 5 civilian complaints, 2 for excessive force, and 3 for unprofessional conduct. Each time, internal investigations had found insufficient evidence to warrant serious discipline, but the pattern was clear. Williams read through the complaint details carefully. A traffic stop where Thompson had been accused of using unnecessary roughness during an arrest. A domestic dispute call where the homeowner claimed Thompson had been aggressive and insulting. A noise complaint where Thompson allegedly made inappropriate comments about the resident's immigration status. Each incident by itself might have been explained away as misunderstandings or heated moments. But taken together, they painted a picture of an officer who had lost his way, who had stopped seeing the people he served as human beings deserving of respect and dignity. Williams closed the file and leaned back in his chair. He thought about Saturday night, about the hatred he had seen in Thompson's eyes, about the moment when spit had hit his shoes and pants. He thought about all the other officers who might have similar attitudes, who might be treating citizens with the same disrespect and prejudice. This was exactly why he had taken this job. Not for the salary or the prestige, but because departments like this one needed leaders who understood what it felt like to be on the receiving end of police misconduct. Williams had spent his career trying to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served, but Saturday night had reminded him how wide that gap still was. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Jake Thompson entered the office like a man walking to his execution. Immafor. Face was pale, and Williams could see sweat stains on his uniform shirt despite the cool morning temperature. "Close the door and have a seat," Williams said calmly. Jake did as instructed, settling into the chair across from Williams's desk. He kept his eyes focused on the floor, unable to meet his new commander's gaze. Williams studied him for a moment before speaking. "Do you know why I asked you here, Officer Thompson?" Jake's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Yes, sir." "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Williams said firmly but without anger. Jake forced himself to look up. Williams' eyes were calm but intense, the eyes of someone who had seen enough of the world to understand both its beauty and its ugliness. "Tell me what you think this conversation is about," Williams continued. Jake swallowed hard. "Saturday night, sir? Our encounter on Maple Street." Williams nodded. "That's right. Now, I want you to tell me exactly what happened during that encounter. Don't leave anything out and don't try to make excuses. Just tell me what you did and said." For a moment, Jake considered trying to downplay what had happened, maybe claiming he had been having a bad day or that there had been some misunderstanding. But looking into Williams's eyes, he knew that any attempt at deception would only make things worse. "I was responding to a noise complaint," Jake began, his voice shaking. "When I got there, I saw you checking your phone by the mailbox. I asked if you lived there and you said yes. Then I asked what you were doing out so late." Williams listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. "You said you were at a work function and that you worked in law enforcement," Jake continued. "I didn't believe you. I thought you were lying about being a police officer." "Why didn't you believe me?" Williams asked. Jake felt his face burning with shame. "Because of how you were dressed. The expensive suit, the nice watch. I thought real cops couldn't afford things like that. And what else?" Jake knew what Williams was asking for, but saying the words out loud felt impossible. "I made some comments about people like you." "What kind of comments?" I said, people like you don't belong in that neighborhood, and that you probably got your job through diversity programs or political connections." Williams remained silent, waiting for Jake to continue. "And then Jake's voice trailed off. "You what, Officer Thompson?" "I spat at you, sir. I spat at your feet and told you that you don't belong wearing a badge." The silence that followed felt endless. Williams sat perfectly still, his hands folded on his desk, his expression unreadable. Jake wanted to apologize, to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but he sensed that Williams wasn't finished with his questions yet. "Have you ever treated other citizens this way?" Williams finally asked. Jake wanted to say no, but he knew that wasn't true. "Sometimes I've been unprofessional. Sometimes." Jake thought about the complaints in his file, about the traffic stops where he had let his frustration get the better of him, about the domestic calls where he had taken sides before hearing all the facts. "More than sometimes," he admitted. Williams opened a file on his desk. Jake recognized it as his own personnel file. 5 complaints in 3 years, Williams said, reading from the documents. "All dismissed due to insufficient evidence, but all following a similar pattern. Citizens claiming you were aggressive, disrespectful, or used excessive force." Jake said nothing. There was nothing to say. "I've spent my entire career trying to understand why good officers go bad," Williams continued. "Why men and women who start their careers wanting to help people end up treating those same people as enemies." Williams stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the parking lot. Sometimes it's the stress of the job, sometimes it's personal problems. At home, sometimes it's just being around the wrong people for too long. He turned back to face Jake. But sometimes, Officer Thompson, it's because the person never should have been a police officer in the first place. Jake felt like he had been punched in the stomach. Sir, I know I made mistakes, but Williams held up a hand to stop him. I'm not finished. You see, I have a decision to make. I can fire you right now for what happened Saturday night. Conduct unbecoming an officer, violation of civil rights, behavior that brings discredit to the department. Any one of those charges would be enough to end your career. Jake's heart was pounding so hard he could barely breathe. Or, Williams continued, I can give you one chance to prove that you're capable of becoming the kind of officer this community deserves. Jake looked up, hardly daring to hope. If I keep you on, you will be on probation for the next 6 months. You will attend additional training on constitutional policing, cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation techniques. You will be partnered with one of our most experienced officers who will evaluate your performance on every call. Williams sat back down and leaned forward. More importantly, you will write a detailed report about every complaint that has been filed against you. You will examine your own behavior honestly and identify what you could have done differently, and you will meet with me every week to discuss your progress. Jake nodded eagerly. Yes, sir. I'll do whatever it takes. I'm not finished, Williams said sternly. If you receive even one more complaint during this probationary period, you're gone. If you show any sign of the attitude you displayed Saturday night, you're gone. If you fail to complete any part of the training or evaluation process, you're gone. Williams paused to let that sink in. And Officer Thompson, let me be crystal clear about something. The only reason I'm giving you this chance is because I believe that every person deserves an opportunity to change, to become better than they were. But this is your only opportunity. There will not be another one. Jake felt tears forming in his eyes. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. Williams studied him for a long moment. We'll see. Your probation starts immediately. Report to Sergeant Martinez in the training division at 1400 hours today. He'll get you started on the additional training requirements. Jake stood up, his legs still shaky. Commander Williams, I want you to know how sorry I am for Saturday night. There's no excuse for how I behaved. Williams nodded. You're right, there isn't. But apologies are just words, Officer Thompson. What matters now is what you do with this second chance. As Jake reached the door, Williams called his name one more time. Thompson. Yes, sir? Remember that every person you encounter while wearing that uniform is someone's son or daughter, someone's mother or father. They deserve to be treated with the same respect you would want for your own family. Jake nodded and left the office, closing the door quietly behind him. As he walked down the hallway, he felt like a different person than the one who had entered that office an hour ago. 3 months into his probation, Jake Thompson was a different man. The change hadn't happened overnight, and it certainly hadn't been easy. The additional training sessions with Sergeant Martinez had been humbling, forcing Jake to confront uncomfortable truths about his own biases and behavior. The weekly meetings with Commander Williams had been even more challenging. Each session involved reviewing Jake's interactions with citizens, analyzing his decisions, and discussing what he could have done better. Williams never let him off easy, pushing him to think deeper about the impact of his actions and words. Jake's partner during this probationary period was Officer Lisa Chen, a 15-year veteran known for her professionalism and community relations skills. At first, Jake had resented being paired with someone who was essentially watching his every move. But over time, he began to appreciate her guidance and expertise. You're getting better, Chen told him one afternoon as they finished up a domestic dispute call. 6 months ago, you would have taken sides the moment we walked in that door. Today, you listened to both parties and helped them find a solution. Jake nodded, though he still felt uncertain about his progress. It's harder than I thought it would be. Changing how you think about things. The hardest part is admitting that you needed to change in the first place, Chen replied. Most officers never get to that point. That evening, Jake sat in his living room writing his weekly report for Commander Williams. This week's assignment was to review his response to a traffic stop where the driver had been argumentative and uncooperative. In the past, Jake would have escalated the situation, maybe written additional tickets or found reasons to search the vehicle. Instead, he had remained calm, explained the violation clearly, and treated the driver with respect despite the man's attitude. As Jake wrote about the encounter, he thought about how differently it could have gone. He remembered the old version of himself, the officer who saw every interaction as a contest to be won rather than a service to be provided. That officer had been angry, defensive, and quick to assume the worst about people. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. Jake opened the door to find Commander Williams standing on his porch, dressed in civilian clothes. "Commander," Jake said, surprised. "Is everything okay?" "I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by," Williams replied. "Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Jake invited him in, offering coffee or water. Williams accepted a glass of water and took a seat in the living room. This was the first time Jake had seen his commander outside of the police station, and it felt strange, but somehow less intimidating. "How are things going, Thompson?" Williams asked. "And I don't mean just with work. How are things at home?" Jake was surprised by the personal question. "Better, actually. My wife says I'm easier to live with these days. I don't come home angry every night like I used to." Williams nodded. "Anger is exhausting both for the person carrying it and for everyone around them." "Can I ask you something, sir?" Jake said. "Go ahead." "Why did you give me a second chance? I mean, what I did that night, most people wouldn't have been so forgiving." Williams was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the suburban street. "You want to know the truth? I almost didn't. My first instinct was to fire you immediately and make an example out of what happens when officers cross the line." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "But then I remembered something my first commander told me when I was a young officer." Williams continued. "He said that our job isn't just to punish people for their mistakes. It's to help them become better than they were." Williams turned to look directly at Jake. "I've seen what happens when departments just throw away problem officers without trying to fix the underlying issues. Those officers either end up in other departments where they cause the same problems, or they get replaced by new officers who make the same mistakes. So you decided to try to fix me instead," Jake said. "I decided to give you the opportunity to fix yourself," Williams corrected. "There's a difference." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Finally, Jake spoke up again. "I've been thinking a lot about that night. About the things I said and did. I keep trying to understand how I got to that point." "And what have you figured out?" Jake took a deep breath. "I think I was scared. Not physically scared, but scared about my job, my future, my ability to provide for my family. And when I saw you in that expensive suit, living in that nice house, it reminded me of everything I felt like I was failing to achieve." Williams listened without interrupting. "But that's not an excuse," Jake continued quickly. "Being scared or frustrated doesn't give anyone the right to treat other people the way I treated you. I want you to know that I understand that now." "Understanding is the first step," Williams said. "But it's only the first step. What matters is what you do with that understanding." Williams finished his water and stood up. "I should let you get back to your report, but before I go, I want to tell you something." Jake stood as well, waiting. The officer who responded to a suicide attempt last week, who talked a young man down from a bridge and probably saved his life. That officer showed compassion, patience, and real skill. That was you, Thompson. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Williams said firmly. "You did what the right kind of officer would have done. The old version of yourself might have been too impatient or too quick to use force. But you talked to that young man like he mattered, like his life had value." Williams headed toward the door, then paused. "That's the officer I hope you'll continue to be." After Williams left, Jake sat back down at his desk to finish his report. But instead of writing about the traffic stop, he found himself thinking about the suicide call from the previous week. The young man had been standing on the railing of an overpass, tears streaming down his face, threatening to jump if anyone came closer. Jake's first instinct had been to call for backup and set up a perimeter, but something about the boy's face had reminded him of his own younger brother, who had struggled with depression in college. Instead of treating it like a tactical situation, Jake had approached it like a conversation. He had talked about his own struggles, about times when life had felt overwhelming, about the people who had helped him through difficult periods. Slowly, carefully, he had built trust with the young man until finally convincing him to step down from the railing. At the time, Jake had just felt relief that the situation had ended peacefully. But now, thinking about William's words, he realized something important had happened during that call. For the first time in years, he had seen the person he was trying to help as a complete human being, not just a problem to be solved or a threat to be contained. That night, Jake called his brother. They talked for over an hour about life, family, and the importance of being there for each other. It was the longest conversation they had had in years. The next day at work, Jake noticed things he hadn't paid attention to before. The way Officer Chen took extra time to explain procedures to confused citizens. The way Sergeant Martinez always asked about officers' families and personal lives. The way Commander Williams made a point of walking through the station each morning, checking in with everyone from senior officers to civilian staff. These weren't just good cops, Jake realized. They were good people who happened to be cops, and maybe with enough work and dedication he could become one of them. During his weekly meeting with Williams that Friday, Jake brought up something that had been on his mind. "Commander, I've been thinking about that young man from the bridge call. I'd like to follow up with him, maybe connect him with some resources for ongoing support." Williams looked pleased. "That's a good idea. Work with our community liaison office to identify appropriate programs." "There's something else," Jake said. "I'd like to volunteer for some of the community outreach events. I know I'm still on probation, but I think it would help me understand the community better." Williams studied him for a moment. "What kind of events are you interested in?" "Maybe the youth programs or the neighborhood watch meetings. Anything where I can interact with people in a positive way, instead of just responding to problems." Williams made a note in Jake's file. "I'll talk to the community relations coordinator about getting you involved. But remember, this is about serving the community, not about making yourself look good." "I understand, sir. I just want to be the kind of officer the community deserves." As Jake left Williams' office that day, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: pride in wearing his uniform. Not pride in the authority it represented, but pride in the opportunity it gave him to make a positive difference in people's lives. He still had 3 months left on his probation, and he knew the real test would come when he was back on regular duty without constant supervision. But for the first time since that night on Maple Street, Jake Thompson felt like he might actually deserve to call himself a police officer. 6 months after Jake Thompson's probation began, Commander Williams sat in his office reviewing the transformation that had taken place within the department. Jake's case had become something of a turning point, not just for one troubled officer but for the entire culture of the police force. The statistics spoke for themselves. Civilian complaints had dropped by 45% in the past 6 months. Community satisfaction scores had improved dramatically. Most importantly, other officers had begun to take notice of the changes and were requesting additional training on their own. Jake's probation was officially ending today, and Williams had scheduled a final evaluation meeting. As he prepared for the conversation, Williams reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The transformation hadn't been without setbacks. There had been moments when Jake had struggled with old habits, times when his patience had been tested, and he had almost reverted to his previous behavior. But each time he had caught himself, applied the techniques he had learned, and found better ways to handle difficult situations. A knock on the door interrupted Williams's thoughts. "Come in." Jake entered the office looking confident but respectful. The change in his demeanor was remarkable compared to the broken man who had sat in that same chair 6 months earlier. "Have a seat, Thompson," Williams said. "I think you know why you're here." "Yes, sir. The end of my probationary period." Williams opened Jake's file, which had grown considerably thicker over the past 6 months. Performance evaluations, training, Certificates, community feedback forms, and incident reports painted a picture of an officer who had completely rebuilt his approach to policing. "Let's start with the numbers," Williams said. 0 complaints in 6 months. Perfect scores on all training evaluations. Positive feedback from every community event you've participated in. And 3 commendations, including one from the family of that young man you helped on the bridge. Jake nodded but didn't interrupt. "But numbers only tell part of the story," Williams continued. "What's more important is the feedback I've been getting from your fellow officers and the community members you've interacted with." Williams pulled out a letter from the file. "This is from Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly woman whose house was burglarized last month. She wrote to thank you for the extra time you spent helping her understand the insurance process and connecting her with victim services." He set that letter aside and picked up another. "This one is from the teenagers you've been working with in the after-school program. They want to invite you to their graduation ceremony." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. "That means a lot, sir." "There's one more piece of feedback I want to share," Williams said. "It's from Officer Chen, your probationary partner." Williams read from Chen's evaluation report. "Officer Thompson has demonstrated a complete transformation in his approach to policing. He now consistently treats all citizens with dignity and respect, regardless of their background or circumstances. He has become someone the community can trust and someone I'm proud to work alongside." Williams closed the file and looked directly at Jake. "Based on all of this feedback and my own observations, I'm removing you from probationary status effective immediately. You're back to full duty." Jake exhaled deeply, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "Thank you, Commander. I won't let you down." "You already haven't let me down," Williams replied. "But more importantly, you haven't let yourself down, or the community." Williams stood up and walked to his window, gesturing for Jake to join him. Together, they looked out at the street below, where people were going about their daily lives. "You know what I see when I look out there?" Williams asked. "What's that, sir?" "I see the people we've sworn to serve and protect. Every one of them has a story, has struggles, has dreams and fears just like we do. The badge we wear gives us the privilege of being part of their lives, usually during some of their worst moments." Williams turned to face Jake. 6 months ago, you had forgotten that. You had started seeing people as problems to be dealt with rather than human beings deserving of respect. Do you understand what changed? Jake thought for a moment. "I think I started seeing myself differently. When I realized how wrong I had been, how much damage I had done, it made me want to be better. Not just as a cop, but as a person." "That's exactly right. Real change doesn't come from external pressure or fear of punishment. It comes from an internal recognition that who you were wasn't who you wanted to be." Williams walked back to his desk and picked up a small box. "There's something else I wanted to give you today." He handed the box to Jake, who opened it to find a new badge. But this wasn't just any badge. It was a special commendation pin, awarded to officers who had demonstrated exceptional community service. "This is usually given to officers with many years of exemplary service," Williams explained. "But the community outreach coordinator recommended you for it based on your work with the youth programs and your response to that suicide call." Jake stared at the pin, barely able to believe what he was seeing. "Sir, I don't know what to say." "Say that you'll continue to be the kind of officer the community deserves." "I will, sir. I promise." As Jake prepared to leave, Williams had one more surprise for him. "There's actually something else we need to discuss. I've been asked to recommend an officer for a new position that's opening up. Community Liaison Coordinator. It would involve working directly with neighborhood groups, schools, and local organizations to build better relationships between the police and the community." Jake's eyes widened. "You're considering me for that position?" "I'm not just considering you, I'm recommending you if you're interested." Jake felt overwhelmed. 6 months ago, he had been on the verge of losing his job entirely. Now he was being offered a position that would allow him to help rebuild trust between police and the community. "I'm very interested, sir. More than interested." Williams smiled. the first time Jake had seen his commander truly smile since they had met. Good. The position doesn't start for another month, which will give you time to complete some additional training. But I think you'll find it's exactly the kind of work you're meant to be doing. After Jake left his office, Williams remained at his window, watching the street below. He thought about the conversation he had had with the mayor the previous week about the changes in the department. Crime rates were down, community relations were improving, and morale among officers was at an all-time high. But Williams knew that Jake's transformation was about more than just one officer getting his career back on track. It was proof that people could change, that the right combination of accountability, support, and opportunity could turn even the most problematic situations into success stories. That evening, Williams drove through the neighborhood where he had first encountered Jake Thompson. He passed the house on Maple Street where the confrontation had taken place, remembering the anger and hatred he had seen in Jake's eyes that night. It would have been easy to simply fire Jake and move on. Most commanders would have done exactly that. But Williams had learned long ago that easy solutions rarely led to lasting change. Sometimes the hardest path, the one that required patience and faith in people's ability to grow, was the one that produced the best results. A few blocks away, Jake Thompson was finishing up his shift, responding to a domestic dispute call. As he knocked on the door, he reminded himself of the lessons he had learned over the past 6 months. Listen first. Show respect. Remember that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. The door opened to reveal a young mother holding a crying baby, with an older child clinging to her leg. Behind her, Jake could see a man pacing angrily in the living room. "Good evening, ma'am," Jake said gently. "We received a call about some raised voices. Is everyone okay here?" The woman looked surprised by his calm, respectful tone. "Officer, yes, we're okay. My husband and I just had an argument, nothing serious." Jake could see fear in her eyes, but he also knew that pushing too hard too fast would likely make the situation worse. "I understand. These things happen. Would it be okay if I came in for just a few minutes? Sometimes talking to someone outside the family can help people work through their disagreements." Over the next hour, Jake helped the couple have a productive conversation about their financial stress and communication problems. He provided them with information about counseling services and financial assistance programs. By the time he left, both parents were calmer, and the children had stopped crying. As Jake drove home that night, he thought about the difference between this call and similar ones he had handled in the past. Before his transformation, he might have seen this as a simple domestic dispute, taken a report, and left. Tonight, he had seen it as an opportunity to help a family in crisis find better ways to solve their problems. When he arrived home, his wife met him at the door with a smile. "Good day?" she asked. "Really good day," Jake replied, meaning it completely. "Really good day." The badge in his pocket felt heavier than usual, but it was a good kind of weight. The weight of responsibility, of trust, of the opportunity to make a real difference in people's lives. It was the weight that every police officer should carry, and for the first time in his career, Jake Thompson was proud to bear it. 6 months earlier, a moment of hatred and prejudice had nearly destroyed 2 lives. But through the power of accountability, redemption, and second chances, that same moment had become the foundation for positive change that would impact an entire community for years to come. Commander Williams had been right. Sometimes the hardest path really was the one that led to the best destinations.